Hey everyone, big news. I just signed a job contract. This is going to be my first job as an independent physician. I can't talk about all the details yet, but I wanted to go a little bit through my process to give you an idea of what it's like for doctors in training who are coming out of training and looking for jobs. I signed this contract pretty early because I still have another 15 months of training left, but depending on their specialty, it's relatively common for doctors to start looking for jobs around this time. There's a ton of variables in looking for a job depending on specialty, depending on how old you are, depending on where you live, but I wanted to give you an overview to give you an idea of my experience, just so you can see what I went through. Before we go too far, I want to thank today's sponsor, which is Masterworks.io. I'll tell you about this art investment company in a little bit. Before I go too far, I wanted to remind everybody where I am at in my training. So I'm a second-year GI fellow right now, which means that I went to high school, then I went to 4 years of college, then I went to 4 years of medical school. I completed a 3-year internal medicine residency, and now I'm in the second year of a 3-year GI fellowship. For years now, my goal has been to be a GI physician, and I'll be finally qualified to do that as of July 2023. Clearly, the road to becoming a doctor, especially a specialist like a GI doctor, is very long. Up until this point, my job searches in my life have been kind of relegated to the rigorous, stressful application processes for college and then medical school and then residency and then fellowship, which I've quickly learned is very different than the job search. Applying it for each step of the way for medical training, I've always been one of dozens of people trying to get one single spot. And that's why things have suddenly changed when I'm looking for a real job. Suddenly, I'm the one that's wanted. That's definitely the most striking element of my job search. So what do I mean by that? My potential employers are trying to show their worth to me and win me over from other potential employers. Because now suddenly they need me more than I need them. It's completely switched. This is partly because I'm looking for work in St. Louis, Missouri, which isn't exactly a hotspot for GI doctors. But it's the case to some extent everywhere you look, especially when you compare to med school, residency, or fellowship applications. To say there's a surplus of qualified people for med school, residency, and fellowship is an understatement. There's very few spots and there's tons of people looking for them. But now everything's different. For example, I probably get 2 to 3 emails from GI practices across the country asking me if I want to interview for their job. There's plenty of work out there for GI doctors and other specialties too. I knew I wanted to be in St. Louis, so that narrowed things down a lot for me, which was nice. It also helped because I had the advantage of knowing about the areas in St. Louis and knowing a lot of the practices, and the attending physicians I work with at my training program have familiarity with the private practices as well as the academic practices around the city. So I kind of started there getting a little bit of advice from people that I knew, doctors, attending physicians, and then I started contacting practices that I was interested in. I found 3 practices that sounded great and had availability, meaning they were looking for people to join. So I set up meetings with them. This is commonly done with a recruiter who either works for the practice or works for a larger company that kind of works as a for-hire agency for practices across the country. All the recruiters I worked with were specifically working with the practice that I was interested in, which was nice because then they were intimately familiar with it and they didn't have ulterior motives. During my initial meetings, it wasn't necessarily a formal interview, but it was getting to know the recruiter who could give me a lot of details about the job, and then meeting the doctors that were in the practices. They could tell me what a normal day would be like, how many patients they see, what hospitals they go to, how many calls they get overnight when they're on call. Lots of nitty-gritty stuff like that, just to get an idea of what the people are like and what the practice is like. We would also talk about benefits. That means things like salary, a signing bonus, other investment opportunities. Like for GI, it's possible to buy into a surgery center where you do your procedures for some practices. Health insurance, vacation, guaranteed salary, how you make your salary. There's tons of new details. This was entirely new to me because when you're applying for residency or applying for fellowship, you don't really worry about those things because the pay and the benefits are very similar across all the different programs that you're applying to. You also don't have much negotiating power, so while it's important to know them, it's not as important because you can't really change them. And then, of course, you don't get investment opportunities like being able to have infusion income or buy into a surgery center or things like that when you're in training. But when it's going to be your job for potentially 30 years down the road, you want to know because you're going to be invested in it both literally and figuratively, and you don't want to have to just jump around. When you're applying for training positions, those are going to be temporary just by their very nature. Money certainly isn't everything when you're looking for a job, but you want to make sure that you're going to be compensated fairly and compensated in a way that doesn't cause you to burn out. You want to be able to enjoy your life outside of medicine, and you don't want to have to work yourself to death trying to keep a reasonable salary. That's precisely why having other potential income sources from your job is ideal, like being able to get revenue from a surgery center if you're a GI doctor, for example. While we're talking a bit about finances, I think it's probably a good time to go through today's sponsor, Masterworks.io. One of the big changes in going from being a training physician to an independent physician is that your salary is going to go up a lot. And this has made me personally think a lot about my saving and investment strategies. There's a lot of ways to spend, save, or invest your hard-earned money, but there's one way that I didn't consider until I heard about today's sponsor, Masterworks.io. Masterworks is a company that lets you invest in fine art. Now, investing in art is something that I associate with the ultra-wealthy, mainly because art is so expensive. But here's how Masterworks does it. Their team of art experts analyze over 60,000 data points to find trending artists with high potential for growth, like Banksy or Picasso. Then they purchase paintings by these artists. After they go out and buy them, you can purchase shares representing an investment in those artworks on their platform. So even if you don't know a lot about art, like me, you can still invest in it without investing a lot of your time trying to find out which artwork pieces are the best. So now you can include high-end artwork in your investment portfolio without having to buy a $10 million painting all by yourself. Obviously, people like you and me are more used to dealing with traditional stocks and bonds with investing, but I was honestly shocked to learn that contemporary art prices outpaced the S&P 500 total return by 164% from 1995 to 2021, according to Citibank. And Masterworks helped you access this amazing asset class. They've been around since 2017, and their team has over 75 years of art buying experience with plans to purchase $400 million in art pieces next year. Over 350,000 investors signed up, and Masterworks is already worth over $1 billion. The uniqueness of this opportunity has resulted in a lot of demand, but since I've partnered with them on this video, you can gain priority access by clicking the link in the description. Check them out. So back to the job search, I mentioned that kind of initial discussions talk about the basic benefits and then getting really into the practice and how it operates and what the people are like, because that's what you want to know. You want to make sure these are people that you're going to get along well with and you're going to work well with, because potentially you'll be working with them for 20, 30 years. After I had my initial meeting with all three of these practices, everything sounded great. There wasn't any big turnoffs or anything like that, so I wanted to move forward with the next step. This next step in general involves more of a formal interview. It's still nowhere near as formal as the interviews that we do in training for medical school, residency, or fellowship, but it's a time where you can ask questions of the practice and they can ask questions of you. For me, the dynamic difference is again very apparent when you're doing this, meaning that they need or are interested in you a lot more than you are necessarily interested in them, which is kind of nice. They want to make sure that you understand everything about the practice and that all of your questions are answered. And they're trying to sell their practice to you, to point out the great benefits of it, why it's in a unique practice, why it's going to be potentially a good fit. Overall, very low stress interviews, which was awesome. For me, since this was still COVID times, they were partially Zoom, but partially in person as well. It's definitely hard to compare these practices because they all sound great and they all have different elements. So kind of like that saying, comparing apples to oranges. You're not just looking at the same job and three different salaries and you're just picking the higher salary, for example. There's a lot of intricate differences between them. When you're applying for training positions, you're usually just looking for a fit with the residents and a location that you're interested in when trying to rank. It's a little bit more complicated now because, again, of the longevity of this job that you're looking for. Going back to looking at compensation, again, I want to stress compensation is not everything, but there's a lot more to consider when you're looking for an independent job as opposed to the training positions. As I said, with the training positions, it's generally the same salary within reason for everyone, and you're paid in the same way, just the same or regular amount every month. But here, there's a lot of different ways that you can get paid. For example, it's very common, at least in the GI world, to make a fixed amount for a couple of years. And then after that, your pay is exclusively based off of your production, meaning how many colonoscopies you do, how many patients you see in clinic. Other places, if it's a true private practice, then your income is going to be based on how much money you bring in doing colonoscopies, seeing patients, but subtracting out the overhead or the expenses. That might mean the expenses from hiring a nurse or from keeping the lights on or paying the rent or buying scopes. If a scope breaks and you need a new one, that's really expensive, thousands of dollars, tens of thousands. But having your own independent practice also means you can hire anesthesia or have your own infusion center for medicines for inflammatory bowel disease, and you can get a proceed of the income from that. So that's another way to increase your salary without having to do 100 extra colonoscopies necessarily. Again, work-life balance and not wanting to burn out is very relevant, especially in this day and age. But at the same time, it's more of a headache sometimes to deal with all that stuff. So if you're not interested in it, there are other jobs where you just work for a hospital and the hospital deals with all that. They take all the extra income, but they just kind of tell you what you need to do and you do it, then you go home. There's no right answer. It's just what appeals to you more and what you think will fit better with your lifestyle and your desired future lifestyle. After the interviews, if both parties are still interested, then you move to the offer stage. This is where they give you an offer, say, hey, we're interested in you. We're willing to pay you this much, maybe give you this much of a signing bonus. You'll have this many days off. A lot of that information you might have known already, but often the exact salary and the exact signing bonus don't get disclosed until this point in the process. So it's a pretty big deal, especially considering that these salaries are so much more than a doctor received while they were still in training. It was kind of an exciting moment to kind of see these offers and think about the money and that you're going to earn after this incredibly long road of working through training, going through medical school, residency, and for me, fellowship as well. So then is the hard part. You weigh all of this. You don't want to let the money weigh too heavily on you, but obviously money factors significantly into the decision. And you have to decide. And once you kind of weigh the offers, weigh the elements, think about how well you got along with the people in the practice and everything like that, then you pick which offer you like best and ask them to give you a full contract. That'll be all of the medical legalese, the technical details of the contract, going through incredible detail. One thing that was new to me in these contracts was the notion of a non-compete clause. The idea behind a non-compete clause is if you leave the practice down the road, let's say you work there for 5 years and you decide you want to leave, they don't want you to take the patients that you got there and pull them away to this new practice that you're going to start, right? Because you use the resources of this practice that you're joining to find those patients and to cultivate that relationship. So the idea is that it's not fair for you to just take them. So what they do is they say for X amount of time, you can't work doing this specialty within X amount of distance. So it might be a 1 year, 10-mile non-compete, which means over the next year after you quit your job, you cannot practice in the 10-mile radius around where you're currently practicing, around where this practice is. It's kind of a strange idea, at least to me, but it serves a purpose. And these non-competes can be varying. They can be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. They can be 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles. They can have significant ramifications. Sometimes if doctors are unhappy and they want to leave their job, if the non-compete is strict enough, they could sometimes have to leave the city they want to be in for a short amount of time, whatever that cutoff is, the 1 year, the 2 year, before they can come back and work at a different practice in the city that they're interested in. So they can be very restrictive, and it's something definitely that's important to consider. When you're going through these details on the contract, it's often helpful to have a lawyer involved to review things, make sure the language isn't unusual, and to help with negotiations if there's something that you want to change. I used a lawyer during my process, and it was very helpful. After discussing the contract with your lawyer and going through negotiations with usually between the lawyer that you're working with and the lawyer at the practice that you're interested in, the contract is finalized, and then you sign it. And that's what I did last week. It was a very long process. I started the kind of early interviews in early December, and now with mid-March, I'm finally finishing. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to take that long for everyone. It's not as regimented as the training process applications are, like for residency or fellowship. Those are very strict exact dates that you have to submit your application, do your interviews, decide about your interviews, and those sorts of things. This is much more fluid and nebulous, which in some ways is good, so it gives you time to really think. But for me, it was certainly a long time that I took to think, from December to March. So now I'm really excited. I'm going to start filling out the onboarding paperwork. I can't give exact details yet about which practice it is, but I'll be releasing a video about the practice that I've signed with and talking about that in a lot more detail. And in the future, in a little over a year when I start that, I'll definitely be making videos kind of explaining what it's like to be a new attending physician, a new independent physician done with training, and what those differences are like. So stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for sticking with me through all of this. Please check out masterworks.io if you're interested. The link is in the bio to sign up for that. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks.